I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, a conversation I recorded last month but only have just gotten around to publishing with renowned foreign policy expert Vali Nasr, author of the new book, Iran's Grand Strategy, A Political History. In light of everything that has happened with Iran and the US in the past few months, this conversation is undoubtedly timely, and I hope you'll find it enlightening. It provides a rather nuanced perspective on Iran, its regional ambitions, how it perceives the United States, and much, much more. We will also be discussing the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat and Vali's perspective on that. It's a bit different than what you may have heard from previous guests on this show. I think you'll find it very interesting. But before we get to the conversation, I'd like to remind you that you can support my work on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. A shout out to one of my most recent $10 and above tier supporters, Aaron, who will be receiving a producer's credit shout out at the end of the episode. If you'd like your own producer's credit shout out, subscribe to Parallax Views on Patreon at the $10 or above tier. Patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. Also, if you can, please check out the work of Mike Swanson at Wall Street Window. Other than my Patreon supporters, Mike is my only sponsor, and Wall Street Window is a financial and trading newsletter I am more than happy to promote on this show. I have had listeners tell me that they've made return on investment thanks to Mike's trading tips at wallstreetwindow.com, where you can also get a copy of his book, The Twofold Formula, the best trading pattern I have ever used. That's a free ebook if you sign up to the wallstreetwindow.com newsletter. Check it out there. You will not be disappointed. And with that being said, let's get right to the conversation with Vali Nasr. Welcome to Parallax Views. A guest that I'm really excited to have on, Vali Nasr, is a professor of international affairs and Middle East studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and the author of the recent book, Iran's Grand Strategy, A Political History, which we're going to be talking about. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great, and I'm really intrigued by this book. I've been reading through it, and I think it's an antidote to a lot of what I would say is kind of oversimplified thinking about the Islamic Republic of Iran. Maybe to start out, we could talk about what this book is pushing back against, because I think there's the narrative I often hear in popular discourse is that the Islamic Republic, since the revolution, has just been run by these mad mullahs, and there's this assumption that there's no rationality to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I think that's a mistake. Maybe you could speak to that. Are you trying to push back on that with this book?
Yes, exactly. I think even if you have an adversary, it's important for you to take your adversary seriously and try to understand, why do they look at the world the way they do. And it is not very helpful to sort of characterize Iran as run by irrational, mad religious clerics who look to religious texts for inspiration and whose anti-Americanism is born out of cultural religious prejudice. The reality is that the Islamic Republic has a theory of history. It, for right or wrong reason, it thinks that the United States is a threat to Iran. It's a threat to its independence. In the past, in the 1950s, it helped stage a coup in Iran. It was part of Iran's political setup during the Shah's period, which the revolution overthrew. And that since the revolution, the United States has never reconciled with the reality of the revolution and wants to topple it. Now, this may be a wrong assumption or maybe an exaggerated assumption, but it's a secular security assumption that many countries like Russia may have about Europe or the US. And the Islamic Republic is not on an expansionist bent to conquer the world. It largely is on a path how to back the United States off, keep it from interfering inside Iran, keep it away from its borders. And then the methods that he has deployed for doing these perhaps have been self-defeating because it has only escalated conflict with the US.
One of the stories you bring up in the introduction is this meeting between Henry Kissinger and an Iranian figure, and they end up talking about Immanuel Kant. Maybe you could explain that story and what happened in that story and why you thought it was significant, because it stood
Well,
out to me.
No, absolutely. And I think the reason is the same reason that it really stood out to me as well, because Henry Kissinger is a realist geostrategist. He dealt with the two other reference points we have for Iran, namely the Soviet Union and China. He met with Brezhnev. He met with Mao. He knew how to deal with them, and he understood ideology and geopolitics very well. And at the same time, also, Kissinger was very well known for writing essays like Iran needs to stop being a movement and being a country, which implies that a movement is irrational, it's emotional, it's ideological, whereas a country has rational national interests. And so when this meeting happened, I think Kissinger was curious to learn more about Iran, but Kissinger also sees the basis of his geopolitical thinking not to be international relations theory, but to be Immanuel Kant, and particularly the theory Immanuel Kant had about perpetual peace, that peace will only come about when the other side gets totally exhausted by war, or both sides get totally exhausted by war, and no one wants to fight for another inch of territory. And he sort of pushes this Iranian interlocutor on when is it Iran is going to get tired of the revolution and begin to act like a normal state. And why are you being so irrational? But what Kissinger didn't understand or didn't know was that his Iranian interlocutor had translated several books of Kant into Persian, which showed that he was not some woolly-brained ideologue who only knew the Quran. He was as well-versed in the German philosophers' theories as Kissinger was. And he basically told Kissinger, we want to see when are you going to get tired of being an imperialist? When are you going to get tired? In other words, as false as the premise it might be, but the reality was that he was saying Iran has some very secure, secular, understandable objectives, which are immediately understandable by Immanuel Kant. We're trying to exhaust you in the Middle East. We're trying to exhaust you in Iraq. We're trying to get you to leave us alone, and you're not leaving us alone. And so it really spoke to how little we know about Iran, because at that moment, I think Kissinger was completely blown off his seat, which is not an easy thing to do given his girth towards the end of his life. But the reality was that he had not expected that kind of sort of rational strategic thinking, which was illiterate in terms of the very philosophy that has guided his own foreign policy all along.
At one point early on in the book, you talk about how Khomeini, the supreme leader, talks about how Iran is close to achieving its strategic goals. And he actually says it, as in Iran, has climbed the foothills and is nearing the mountain peak. And you ask a very important question, a very obvious one. What is at that peak that he's speaking of? And what's the goal that Iran is seeking?
So Iran's goals are not wise or advised. No other country is trying to follow the path that Iran is. Namely, Iran wants to become a regional power, a global power, a developed country, but wants to do it without engaging the US and despite the United States. But as every other country around the world over the years understood, including China, Russia, that if you want to grow economically, you need to bury the hatchet with the US, you need to be part of the global economy. Iran's goal is development, which is not very different from other countries, except the way it wants to go about it is by trying to circumvent the United States. And so what he says is that we're very close to basically achieving our goal because we're going to eventually push the US out of the region. We're going to get to our goal. Now, this is obviously in light of the recent war, looks like a outlandish or childish assumption. And in fact, the challenge that Iran faces after this war is exactly that. But I think Khamenei's hope was that Iran could develop at the same time as getting the United States to abandon the Middle East, that it would be able to be a great power on its own terms, not on US's terms.
Since you brought up the recent, what's been called the 12-Day War, does that change anything about the book that you wrote? In the sense of, does it outdate anything? Or have your views changed at all on anything? How would you look at the book from the before and after?
No, you're right. I didn't get a chance to write a post-mortem on some of Iran's policies. But I think the fundamental logic is still in play in Iran. The Islamic Republic did not fall. It has not come out with a white flag, and it has not declared that we're now from tomorrow going to be friends of the United States. This is not like immediately after Hiroshima, where the Japanese said from tomorrow we will be pro-American, sign a deal, and everything is over. So Iran is still at a war with the US. The assumption of why Iran should be at war with the US are still there. But the strategies that Iran deployed for advancing its cause, or as the supreme leader said, for getting closer to the peak of the mountain, have collapsed. So, of course, this is an ongoing picture. Anytime I would have write this book, it would be outdated by events as they unfold. But I think the value of the book is that as we are engaging Iran today, as we're trying to understand where is it going to go from here, we have to have a firm understanding of where is it coming from. These leaders of the Islamic Republic, what are their fundamental assumptions? And I just give you a quick parallel. I mean, it's impossible to understand their deal with Russia without understanding why are they afraid of Western encroachment on Russia's Western flank, right? Where does that come from? It's not enough to say, well, Putin is a megalomaniac, deranged leader, right? The theories of Russian nationalism that he advocates are premised on a history. We want to have a peace treaty with him. We want to defeat him. We want to speak above his head to his population. We have to have a gauge on that. And I think this book explains how did we get here? It's not sort of a necessarily crystal ball for the future, but it's really a story of why did Iran and the United States arrive at this point?
If you could, the first chapter is called The Loom of History. I was curious, maybe you could talk about what you mean by the loom of history as it relates to Iran and how it conceives of itself.
Well, the United States, for them, most of the history with Iran goes now back to the hostage crisis, 1979, to the revolution. But Iranians have a very deep sense of history. Their geostrategic thinking is drawn from history, whether they consciously do so or not. And particularly the Islamic Republic, both for better or worse, is very much engaged in this historical debate. In fact, the revolution was premised on the idea that Iran had not been an independent country for over 200 years before. They had always been brutalized by imperialism. In fact, and I make this point in the book, that Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the revolution's idea, or in his view, one of Iran's greatest achievements, was not that Iran became Islamic per se, was that Iran became independent, that he and the Islamic Revolution were the first movement and leader to give Iran its true independence, and Iran will only be independent under the Islamic Republic. Now, again, this may be a fallacy, but it tells you that the reading of history is very important. And I make the point that just like you cannot make sense of Russia or China's worldview without taking stock of Russian history under Peter the Great, under Stalin, or China's history under the Ming Dynasty, the Islamic Republic is the same. Iran was not born in 1979. And I try to trace that continuity to say, also, there are geopolitical factors at play here. Let me give you an example. Like Iran's landmass, where is it located? How many times in its history has been invaded? I say that Iran sees itself as a distinguished civilization, like India does, for instance. But Iran is also alone and vulnerable in a region in which it's the only Persian-speaking and Shia Muslim country in a sea of Arab and Turkish-speaking and Sunni-dominated countries, right? Now, this was a fact before the revolution. It's a fact today, and it looms over the thinking of Iran's leaders.
I hope this isn't too off topic, but I'm wondering, I feel as if you really push back on what I would say is like an Orientalist sort of essentialism that treats Iran as just led by irrational fanatics or an irrational other. But I think you also refuse simplistic narratives, maybe coming out of the realist camp of international relations. Are there any disagreements you have with some of the realist understandings of Iran?
Well, I mean, it depends on how they frame it. I think in many ways, realism is more helpful in understanding Iran than sort of what you essentially argued, essentializing idealism.
I
Is to
agree.
say
Yeah.
that Iran is basically is defining its national interest in a particular way. We could debate whether that's wise or not. And I do believe, as I say in the book, it's not wise at many levels. And it's deeply informed by their reading of history and their threat perception. Now, then how Iran proceeds to realize its national interest is very in line with a lot of what realists say. Where does it see alliances? Why does it see use in proxies? I mean, proxies are non-missionary activists to Iran. Proxies were a tool to create balance of power with Israel. I mean, Iranians didn't communicate this very well because of their own ideological language, but they always looked at Hezbollah essentially as a deterrent system against Israel. I mean, today, Israeli generals will tell you that it is only because of the destruction of Hezbollah that they felt they have a free hand to attack Iran directly. So in fact, Iran's most important line of defense was not air defense systems or missiles, but for decades it was Hezbollah. So this was a rational choice they made, which obviously is heinous. And I would say that, and I reflect in the book, that their argument was, well, nobody sells us an air force. Nobody sells us technology. We have no allies. And therefore, US gives F-16s to Israel or F-35s to Israel, or the US builds bases around us. This is our counter strategy. Now, once we understand that, you could say, yes, that's actually quite intelligible for us. Now, we disagree with that, whether this is a good strategy or not, but this is not some missionary activity. Like, let's go conquer the world. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu may, for reasons of trying to rally the Congress to designate Hezbollah as a terrorist or Iran as a terrorist, would go on these bombastic comments like Hezbollah wants to conquer the world and take over the world. But he fully well understood what this was, that Hezbollah was a missile system. And essentially, if it got rid of that missile system, it would change the military balance of power in the Middle East in its own favor.
If you could, I wanted to talk about how memory and experience has affected Iran's strategy and tactics over the years. And particularly, I wanted to focus in on, I know a lot of people talk about 1953 and the coup, and I want to ask you about that later, but what was the role of the Iran-Iraq War in sort of a shifting of tactics for Iran?
I think it looms very, very large, particularly in Iran's security thinking. I mean, the very simple reason for that is that all of Iran's leaders, including the supreme leader, they were very young at their jobs when the revolution happened. Within a year after the revolution, Iran was invaded. They got their on-the-job training on national defense during that war. None of them had experience with that. The Revolutionary Guards was born of that war. The commanders that led it, including the one, like say the famous one, the US killed General Soleimani, they didn't go to military training school. These were 17-year-olds who volunteered to go to the war. They learned everything they know about warfare in the Iran-Iraq war. And there are some large lessons they learned. One was that Iran is alone because of its language, because of its geography, but also because of its revolution. Nobody would condemn Iraqi invasion of Iran. Nobody condemned Iraq's occupation of Iranian territory. Nobody condemned Iraq's use of chemical weapons during the war. Nobody would sell Iran military hardware, etc. And you could say, yeah, Iranians were themselves may have been to blame for some of this. They didn't need to keep American hostages as the war was waged. But the way they see it, obviously, is that Iran has to learn to defend itself by itself and stand on its own feet. Right? There's no broader procurement strategy. There's no broader alliance strategy. You're alone. Secondly, that international rules-based system is not international in the sense that it doesn't apply to everybody equally. The United Nations is a tool in the hands of the West. They would condemn Iran. They would not condemn Iraq. The US would not enforce the Geneva Convention ban on use of chemical weapons, for instance, right? So and I think this is the lesson that was reinforced when they signed an international UN-backed deal with the United States, the nuclear deal, and the US walked away from it and imposed more sanctions on Iran. So that was the second. And thirdly, they actually learned, practicalities of the fact that because they don't have a regular military, they cannot fight regular wars. They cannot fight wars with air force, artillery, tanks. That Iran has to rely on asymmetric warfare. These ideas of Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, all of these were born out of the Iran-Iraq war. And that also the reliance on missiles later on was born out of the Iran-Iraq war. And even their interest in nuclear weapons first became dominant during the latter part of the Iran-Iraq war because they believed that Saddam would only rearm and attack Iran again. And then Saddam got himself into trouble in Kuwait with the US and the threat dissipated. And then Iran sort of shelved the idea of weapons for a number of years. But up to 2003, it was really looking at it very seriously. And that also came out of the Iran-Iraq war.
I wanted to ask you about this concept that looms pretty large throughout the book, forward defense. If I have listeners that are unfamiliar with that, they're not familiar with all these sort of terms. What does forward defense mean?
Well, it actually came out of the Iran-Iraq war. The Iranians came to the conclusion at the end of that war that Iran's border with Iraq was not really defensible with Iran's military capabilities. This was the border that Alexander the Great had come to Iran from, the border the Arabs invaded Iran in the 7th century, and it was the border from which Iraq invaded Iran. And also they came to the conclusion that the United States and the greatest threats that will come from the United States to Iran and from the region to Iran do not come from its east, or from its north. They come from its west, and west meaning that border, from the Iran-Iraq border. So Iran basically thought that its greatest strategic vulnerabilities in the Arab world and in Iraq. And it came to this idea that we need to defend ourselves from within the Arab world, not on our own borders. And so they called it forward defense, in the sense that we need to be present in Iraq, which they ended up being after we gave them the gift of overthrowing Saddam. They had a presence in Lebanon. If there's an opportunity in Syria, in Yemen, we need to create all of these sort of forward defense points. We can only defend ourselves against the United States if we don't fight the United States with tanks the way Saddam did on the border, but we fight them with asymmetric warfare for them within the Arab world. The only way we can protect ourselves against Arab regimes is to fight Arab regimes on their own territory from within the Arab world. Now, this got Iran into a lot of trouble because the Arabs resented it. The United States punished Iran for it. And now the whole thing has collapsed. For a period, it was successful. I mean, think of it this way. Iranians believe that they played a huge part in making the United States fail in Iraq after the 2003 war. Well, now, why did they want the United States to fail? Because they believed if the US succeeded in Iraq, it would immediately turn its attention to invading Iran and toppling the Islamic Republic. So the logic for defending Iran from a US attack and the Islamic Republic from a US attack was to make the United States busy in Iraq and make it fail in Iraq. So to the extent that we abandoned the idea of military involvements in the Middle East, we said, we're going to leave Iraq. 3 presidents in a row now want no military engagement in the Middle East. The Iranians would view as successful. And they did that not by fighting on a border with the US, but fighting the US inside the Arab world, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, and most importantly, in Iraq.
I wanted to ask in regards to, so prior to this 12-day war, were there fruits that were born from the Iranian strategy for Iran? For instance, would something like the rapprochement with Saudi Arabia have been a win for Iran?
Yes, it is. I mean, at some point, they came to the conclusion that one of the ways to maybe reduce threats against Iran was not to bring the Arabs, Americans, and Israelis all together. So one of the major costs of this forward defense, so let's say the benefit of the forward defense was that Iran got a foothold in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, was able to force the United States to abandon Iraq, all of these things. But the downside of it was that it made all of Iran's much more powerful enemies see one common ground, which is Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the United States to basically come together. So at some point, they didn't abandon forward defense, but they decided that they need to actually reduce Iran's threat perception to the Saudis and to the UAE. Now, they were also fortunate because they did in 2020 attack Saudi oil facilities, and the United States under President Trump decided not to react, which led the Saudis to also panic that the US really does not have a commitment to defending them. And so they also become motivated that maybe they also don't want to be in a war camp against Iran because they would be basically the first roadkill before anything happens with Iran itself. And so, yes, you would say that's a degree of pragmatism here. It's not abandoning the strategy. It's understanding that you really don't want to create a situation where normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel would become a really easy facet, where the Arab populations would not object to it, or that Iran comes to be seen as the only problem in the region. So yes, to that extent, I would say it was a way to compensate for the overachievement of forward defense after the Arab Spring and on the road to October 7th attacks.
How important is it do you think it's important that we talk about the October 7th attacks in relation to all of this? Because in some ways, it seemed like Iran was ascendant in some of its goals after October 7th. But I think since this 12-day war, now it feels like the whole, I guess what's been called the axis of resistance is falling apart. How did we get from October 7th to now?
Well, wars have sometimes a tendency that what is initial success by one side is not the verdict of the war. I mean, that's true of Russia, Ukraine too. If you looked at the first phase of the war, it looked like the Russians were going to march into Kyiv at any moment, right? And then it's become a seesaw battle since then. Yes, at the beginning, it looked like Israel was on its back heel and that Iran was ascendant. But I don't think the Iranians had anticipated necessarily the success Hamas would have in wreaking havoc in Israel, the degree to which they would penetrate, shock Israelis, shock world opinion, public opinion. And they also could not have predicted the way in which Israel resolved to respond, right? But I think the importance of it is that it showed a high water mark point for Iran's forward defense strategy, that it was able to create this ring around Israel and put pincer-like pressure on Israel. But it also showed that this ultimately was a brittle strategy. For instance, they were not able to keep Syria intact. Also, October 7th created a mindset in Israel, which we see that play in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, that Israel basically became resolved to cross any previous inhibitions in risk-taking, right? So if Hezbollah was previously a deterrence force, Israel was willing to risk something big in the north, but get rid of Hezbollah once and for all. Or to, as we see, take the fight to Iran itself. So forward defense worked, if you would, for a different Israel. And Israel with its sort of risk and security mindset of before October 7th, but not the Israel that emerged from October 7th. The forward defense was not an answer to that.
I want to go back. I mentioned the 1953 coup. There's a great deal of attention in the past few years on 1953. There was even I believe it was a documentary with Ralph Fiennes that was very, very popular. I think it even won awards. In some ways, I almost feel like it's, and you can correct me on this if you feel that I'm off base, but I almost feel like now people micro focus on it to the exclusion of other incidents in Iranian history throughout the 20th century. How important is it for us to talk about 1953? And do you think sometimes there may be too much focus on it?
Well, in the book, I lay out my own theory of why it's important. I don't believe it was an American coup. I believe it was an Iranian coup. Americans had something, it failed. The Iranians carried the coup themselves. The Americans supported it. So now I think it's important to give Iranians real agency here. It's not like they were puppets. I know this is popular among American left, among many intelligentsia, early historiography of the revolution, but I think it's too simplistic. And the reason is the fight between the Shah and Prime Minister Mossadegh was never about democracy. That was sort of after he was removed by a coup that democracy became a rallying cry. It was two very, very contradictory definitions of what is Iran's greatest threat and how to manage it. The Shah did not like the British. They had removed his father from power. They had abused Iran. He didn't believe that the British should control Iran's oil, but he believed that the greatest threat to Iran's national security was the Soviet Union, which wanted to invade and turn Iran into another Soviet republic. And if you're going to fight the Soviet Union, if like Ukraine today, you have the ill fortune of being a neighbor of the Soviet Union or Russia, you need the West. And Mossadegh was alienating the West. Instead of being compromising on the oil issue, he was alienating them. And they thought this was a national security threat for Iran. Prime Minister Mossadegh was an ardent nationalist. His position against the British was principled and all Iranians would support it. The problem was that he discounted the Soviet threat and saw the British and British imperialism as the greatest threat to Iran, and he miscalculated. He was never able to convince the United States, out of fear of communism, to bully the British on the negotiating table. And he began to gradually lose his own population, or at least an important segment of it, who began to doubt that he has a game plan and began to worry about communism, which was a very big specter then. Now, I think the importance of this is in the fact that those who carried out the revolution have read this history that I laid out here very differently. They see it as America coming in, taking Iran, alienating Iran's right to its own national resources, defending British imperialism, grabbing an Iranian prime minister by the neck and throwing him out, and bringing a puppet to power that they backed, and that puppet abused Iran after that. And so their sinister views of the US goes back to 1953. So one of the arguments that Ayatollah Khomeini had for why the United States should not have an embassy in Iran, because an embassy in Iran would be the operational center for another coup. In the first year of the revolution, the Iranians were obsessed, the Iranian revolutionaries were obsessed with the fact that the US is hatching another 1953, right? So in that sense, it's important. In other words, the entire relationship between Iran and the US from the get-go was around this. And then today, the language of Ayatollah Khamenei about Iran's right to nuclear enrichment is Mossadegh's language about Iran's right to oil. He doesn't want to yield a centimeter, just like Mossadegh didn't. Mossadegh talked about resistance, and so does Khamenei. So to that extent, the 1950 is important, but the American navel gazing about this, that we abuse democracy, etc., is not based on actually, in my opinion, a correct reading of the significance of that event.
What would you say? I know I'm going to have a lot of listeners that are shocked by that because they'll say, "Oh, but this was an American coup." What would your comeback be to them? I guess.
No, it wasn't an American coup. I mean, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the U.S. didn't know about this particular coup. The coup they had in mind was that a military officer would go to Mossadegh, hand him his dismissal letter, which the Shah had signed, and then he would be arrested. And Mossadegh arrested that colonel before he could get to him. And the whole thing fell apart. And the coup that actually took over was hatched by a former senior Iranian general who had been imprisoned during World War II by the British for pro-German sympathies. And he was very popular among the rank and file. He organized units of the military from outside of the capital who came to Tehran and basically occupied the capital. And there was enormous amount of political support then. Even the Shah was actually pretty popular then because he was still a constitutional monarch. He had not turned into an autocrat. And fundamentally, we sort of discount the fact that there were intelligent, serious Iranians who could be simultaneously nationalist, angry at the British, but believe that Mossadegh is getting Iran into a mess. Again, Regie, I give you an exact parallel today. There are people in Iran today at the highest levels of this regime who basically think the United States is unfair, is a bully. Iran has a right to enrich, but are saying, look, call a spade a spade. We cannot stand up to this. This is dangerous. We need to go negotiate. And that was essentially the position of those who carried the coup. Versus Mossadegh, which like Ayatollah Khamenei would say, no, I'm not going to yield an inch. My position is principled. This is our national right. And except the difference is today, those second group doesn't have the capability to stage a coup. At that point, they did.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that Iran's strategy is in a lot of ways rooted in a very long historical arc. Going back to 53, then the revolution, and the Iran-Iraq War. Why do you think it's important that people know this history and understand that the Islamic Republic's primary objective is really this idea of I don't want to mispronounce it, but I think it's istiqlal or independence,
which means independence.
Yeah, and regime survival.
Well, they don't necessarily make a distinction between regime and country. This is a distinction that opponents make, or we make in the West. It's kind of like the way Americans think about American government. It's American government. So in their mind, the revolution, the Islamic Republic and Iran are one and the same thing. I'm not saying that that's true of everybody, but the decision makers in Iran think that way. But look, when you go to the Middle East, you go to Russia, you go to China, the weight of history is really, really huge. These countries not only have a deep sense of history, it's part of their national memory. Now, they may have different interpretations of history, but also it looms very large on how they see the world and make decisions. Like Iran has a very, very entrenched view of abuse by imperialism in the 19th century, which to this day is part of the political language of the country. So you can't really understand why this regime is weak or it's strong or why they're doing what it's doing if you just want to sort of typecast them, that because they're mullahs and because they're religious, that's the way they think, without taking seriously what is their reading of history and what is their own personal historical experiences. And the other side of it is also important, JG. Iran has engaged with the US multiple times since the revolution, including the nuclear deal. And sort of in their learned experience is that you can't trust the US, right? So if you tell them it's great to sit down and talk to the US, give them what they want, they will give you what you want. It's not ideological or religious harangue that comes out. It's their reading of what happened 10 years ago that comes out.
So then, in terms of where things are at now, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but what do you think Iran's next move is?
Well, there are short-term moves, and I don't think they have very good options because they are confronting two nuclear-armed, militarily superior adversaries. They went to war with Israel and the United States. Their lines of defense have been battered. That is their forward defense, Hezbollah, their air defense system, and their main leverage at the negotiating table, which is their nuclear program, has been severely damaged. So it's not very obvious how they go forward. But I also think that the Islamic Republic, in some ways, it's in its twilight years, the Islamic Republic that we've known until now, that it's primed for what comes next. And this war has expedited it. And the debate about Iran's grand strategy, about how do we defend ourselves, how do we pursue national security, how do we avoid a broader war, are central to this. I think Iran is at that point where Soviet Union was under Brezhnev, or China was under Mao. And I think barring a massive war or US invasion of Iran, I think we're going to gradually see a period of transition in Iran. Now, a lot of this transition has to do with the public's desire for better economic conditions, better living conditions, openness to the world, democracy, human rights. They're all there. But a big piece of this is also, can Iran defend itself under the current mold? Can it have the same national objective that it's had for the past 45 years? And if not, then what? So I think we're obviously very close to the end of the war. This dust has to still settle. But those who are ruling over Iran are not necessarily, have not converted to something else, but their ability to prosecute national interests the way they did is not there. So there is intense debate in Iran. Do we adjust? Do we revise? Do we double down? What do we do? And so that's partly why we don't see a very clear message coming out of Iran, is because I think there's serious debate.
Well, how should then, I'm curious, how do you think, in an ideal scenario, how should America be dealing with this transition point that we see Iran in?
Well, the United States is determined not to settle the Iran issue purely by war. It might include invasion, occupation, another Iraq war to the power of 10. So he has to see that how can it take advantage of the outcome of this war to nudge Iran in the right direction, right? So if you want Iranians to gradually move away from this grand strategy that they have followed now, you not only have to give them options, let's say as the negotiating table, that they can trust and they can live with, but you also have to find ways to influence the way they see threat. I think, threatening Iran more and more only convinces this leadership that its back is to the wall and there are no options but doubling down, which might end up in something bigger. So I think America's made its point, right? It can bomb Iran, it's damaged or destroyed its nuclear capabilities. The question is there a diplomatic path now? And I'm not saying necessarily is or it's easy to engage the Iranians, but that's what we have to explore. Is there a diplomatic path? The end result of which is that Iranians could feel less threatened and therefore back away from some of their strategy and also see an alternative pathway to living within the region, addressing varieties of sets of issues. But what I want everybody to understand from this book is that Iran is a state that has been at war for 40 years with the US in its own mind, right? It is a state that has been shaped by war. And therefore, you can change that state, but the reasons for war have to disappear or have to be mitigated. And that, I think, will come through using this moment before Iran makes a decision, for instance, to go nuclear, to double down on its resistance, to try to influence the debate in Iran.
I also wanted to ask you, if you have a few more minutes, about the continuities between the monarchy and then the post-revolution Islamic Republic. Do you see there being continuities? I know that's a controversial question.
No, I do, because it's not a sort of a value judgment. I think there are massive differences. I think it's easy for the Westerners to understand the Shah, not in the way in which media have portrayed him, but as an earlier version of Mohammed bin Salman or Mohammed bin Zayed in UAE, leaders that we have no trouble lauding without talking about human rights records. And the Shah is being judged by his collapse, but not by the fact that he was a modernizer. And also, he was a very adept geostrategist. I mean, the Shah wanted Iran, and that's where the commonality comes about, that the Shah wanted Iran to be a great power. He wanted to be, in fact, the sort of a sole power in the region that the US would rely on. That ambition of Iranian national grandeur is also in the Islamic Republic, except they're going about it in all kinds of ways that actually causes American resistance to their rise, as opposed to American complicity. Right? I think the Shah was very good at getting the US to give Iran everything he wanted: a nuclear program, advanced weaponry, a handoff the security of the Persian Gulf to Iran to manage. Whereas the Islamic Republic wants everything that the Shah wanted and got, but he wants to do it the way I described about the supreme leader. He wants to get to the top of the mountain, but to go around the United States to get there. Whereas the Shah understood that to get to the top of the mountain, you have to use the United States. And I would just say this, JG, for all of those people who talk about 1953, the Shah's view was that Iran needs to deploy the United States against the Soviet Union. It is not that Iran is the puppet of the United States. It is the United States should become a puppet of Iran. In the same way as the Arab countries or Israel tries to maneuver the United States to essentially implement their policy. The Shah invented all of this. I mean, he should be given credit for it. The Islamic Republic's failure is to want everything the Shah wanted, but thinking that you could do it without engaging the US.
Now, on the opposite end of that, do you think there's a potential for Westerners or figures in the US sort of security world to underestimate Iran's ability to adapt? Because it seems like what I'm getting from your book and what I've read of it is that this is not a country that is driven purely by ideology. In fact, oftentimes it can adapt its ideology to its strategic aims. Do you think there's ways in which the US and the Western world can underestimate Iran going forward?
Yes, they can underestimate Iran going forward, and they can underestimate how difficult dealing with Iran can become, even as the regime becomes dysfunctional still. I would say, one of the lessons of the Iran-Iraq war was the same thing we talked about October 7th, that don't be fooled by the early verdict of the war. I mean, what the Iranians learned in Iran-Iraq war is that the first phase of the war, the Iraqis marched into Iran, captured a large port city, captured part of Iran's oil province, and then it took Iran 2 years to figure out how to deal with this. And then they pushed the Iraqis out, and then, yes, the Iranians could not conquer Iraq, but the lesson that the Revolutionary Guards, etc., took out is that this is a 15-round boxing match. Israel may have wanted to knock Iran out in the first round. It didn't. It knocked Iran down. Now, if you're willing to go into a 15-round match with Iran, then you could. But the longer this goes, the more there could be unpredictabilities here.
I want to ask you as well. So, a lot of my listeners are very critical of the U.S. foreign policy on Iran, particularly the way we left the JCPOA. A lot of my listeners are very familiar with the Quincy Institute. I think you did a talk recently there with Trita Parsi. Where do you think we can be critical of U.S. foreign policy on Iran? And where do you think folks may need to be more critical of how Iran has dealt with things?
No, I mean, the criticism of Iran is pretty simple. I mean, their belligerence towards the United States may have got the U.S. to leave Iraq, etc. But every time the Iranians win something, they invite even more pressure, isolation on themselves. And and this strategy of let's escalate the United States in order to de-escalate pressure on ourselves has not really worked. It's got them into war now. But on the U.S. side, I would say that the U.S.'s foreign policy is too easily driven by interest groups, or particularly pro-Israel lobby, evangelical groups, many who essentially have no interest in resolving this and object to any kind of a opening, including, let's say, the nuclear deal with Iran, and or basically either want war with Iran or they want a permanent cordon around Iran. So the problem is that our foreign policy towards Iran is not a foreign policy that is based on strategic thinking. It's not a Kissinger, Brzezinski thinking about how do I solve Iran's problem. It's about 500 congressmen, senators, a lot of them reflecting interest groups, reflecting Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, name it, interests, who essentially are peddling policies that reflect their, I think, perspective or their preferred outcome rather than what should be a good strategic solution. And so I think, in a way, part of the problem in the US is that we are hemmed in by our domestic politics. And one of the big mistakes the Iranians have made is that this escalation of animosity with Israel is actually made the resolution of the problem with the United States more difficult. They've assumed that they could separate these things out, that you could be friends with the US and sign a nuclear deal with the US, but you could actually escalate against Israel at the same time.
Is there arguably a way in which I think there's an argument to be made that the US has long wanted to get out of the Middle East, and that Iran, in the way it has dealt with the US, has actually kept the US coming back to the Middle East in a way the U.S. and Iran want the same thing. They both want, well, the U.S. wants out of the Middle East and Iran wants the U.S. out of the Middle East. So it feels as if Iran's approach may actually be self-defeating.
Yes, it is. And I think particularly after the 12-day war, there is this kind of looking at what worked and what didn't in Iran. But, the Iranians maybe, again, early on learned the long lessons. Like in 1985, there was an attack by Iranian-backed Shia militias on the Marine barracks in Beirut that killed over 500 American Marines. The U.S. left Lebanon, right? So the lesson they learned in Iran is that you could you could chase the US out if you followed these kinds of tactics. They did it in Iraq as well. And so they came to and then you get locked into, just like with the American military and weapon systems, they get locked into this mind of thinking that we can actually chase the US out. We just need to bite our lips, accept the pressure, accept the pushback, and push them out. But in the process, sanctions have ratcheted up. Iran has become economically more isolated, and now Iran is at war. And so it is fundamentally important, and I think that a lot of Iranians are doing this, to ask the question, this isn't working.
Two more brief things here. I wanted to ask you about the hijab protests that happened and how Iran adapted to those protests. I think initially Iran, the state's reaction was, this is almost like a Keller revolution. This is foreign influence. But I think those hijab laws have actually been more lax since then. What was happening with that?
I mean, it's actually very interesting that when the hijab issue happened, Iran's supreme leader gave about 20, 30 different addresses in which he never defended hijab. He never used the word Islam other than as an adjective for Islamic Republic. And he all along said, not that the killing of that young lady had been caused by outside interference, but that immediately as people came out, outsiders tried to use it as a national security issue against Iran and foment trouble. And yes, they're paranoid and they blame all opposition on foreign interference. But just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that people are not after you. And we obviously know that, how Israel has been, how involved they are inside Iran. So it's interesting because that talks about the multipolarity of power in Iran. The hijab crisis was created by a very hardline, religiously sort of inclined president at the time, who decided that his signature initiative was going to be enforcement of hijab. So he deployed these morality police to go round up women, harass them, take them to retraining classes, etc. And one of these cases led to a violent treatment of Mahsa Amini and her tragic death. But many in the security establishment, including Revolutionary Guards, did not see this as very smart. They realized that, look, you have bigger things like confronting Israel, confronting the US, managing Iran's national security. Do you really want to be spending your time in Tehran chasing university students? You really want to alienate your population in that way? And so very quietly, they followed what I would call a don't ask, don't tell policy. Notice they didn't remove things from the laws, but they stopped enforcing it, right? By and large, stopped enforcing it. And so more and more women are not observing it properly, or there are cafes, restaurants, etc., where they don't observe it at all, or they don't wear it in their cars. Yeah, they get fined, but nothing like the level of enforcement that existed before.
What does that tell us about how the state deals with this issue?
Well, I think the state is coming to the realization that its view of America and its view of national security is in the mold of the 1980s. But Iran's population is not the Iran's population of 1980s, right? That if they're going to be too restrictive and hard with their own population, they're only opening a second front. The first front being against outside threats. They're only opening a second front. And I don't think they believe they can fight on two fronts at the same time.
I just, real quick here, I wanted to ask you too about the reaction to the 12-day war in Iran, because I feel like there were a lot of Iranians that may not support the Islamic Republic, but they also didn't take too kindly to the bombing. Were you surprised by that, and what do you think it says?
No, I wasn't surprised, because I think it's too simplistic to think that either Iranians hate the Islamic Republic or they love Iran. I think they can be both. Iranians can be really angry at their own government, but also take affront at the foreign military invading them. Ultimately, nationalism runs deep. And secondly, the war showed them that if it comes to war, people are not going to be spectators, right? In other words, this is not a tennis match in which Israel and Iran play sets and you can cheer for Israel hitting aces. You're basically the net there. And then Israeli bombing basically terrified them. The call to evacuate Tehran terrified them. There was a lot of civilian casualties. And so it's not that they rallied to the government support. They rallied to the defense of their homeland. And they really saw that Israel's war on Iran was a threat to the country itself, to its territorial integrity, to its dissolution, to the collapse of law and order, to collapse of everything, to collapse of their daily lives. Like if the government in Tehran had fallen and there was no police, who would protect their properties from the have-nots? I mean, simple things like that. And so that reality of the war led them to sort of reassess. It doesn't mean there's love for the Islamic Republic. It just means that there's no support for Israeli-American war on Iran.
Do you think that's also what drives the desire for nuclear capabilities? Like, I think what you would say is it's a strategy of deterrence.
The problem for Iran, interestingly, after the 12-day war, there's even demands among secular public in Iran that we need to have a bomb because we cannot be invaded like this by Israel at will. This idea that Israel says they want to be able to mow the lawn anytime they want is not something that's really attractive to average Iranians. But the problem Iran has is that from where it is now to actually having nuclear deterrence is some distance. It's not distance of a decade, but it's sufficient distance that it's both fraught with danger, risk, and more war and conflict. And so it's not an easy decision to say, let's go nuclear. If it means multiple Israeli bombings of Iran, if it might weaken the system more. So it is an option that's on the table because, it's the only ultimate deterrent that might be left to Iran right now. But it's not as straightforward how they get there.
It comes with a great risk. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
I know I have to let you get going. I promise I will let you go, but you mentioned Brzezinski and Kissinger and said something along the lines of they would look at it as how do we solve Iran's problem? I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. How would a realist thinker like a Brzezinski look at dealing with Iran?
But Brzezinski would basically say it's the way he handled Poland. It's like don't back them into a corner where Russia, Soviet Union would invade them. Try to open up the Polish government by restructuring its debt, but getting commitments that it would, give more freedom to its people, etc. And actually, that way he helped create the peaceful transition of Poland from communism to moving towards the West. If he was to think about Iran after this war, he would basically think the same way. In other words, how can we get this regime to basically make a series of decisions that would move it down path A as opposed to path B, right? So, and there's not a silver bullet decision that you're going to change a revolutionary government, but there's a series of sort of acts. It's the same thing he did in negotiations with Deng Xiaoping about normalization with China. And I think that kind of pragmatism is necessary for the US, but that kind of pragmatism today is sullied with political interference from vested interest in the US.
Well, I want to thank you again, Vali Nasr, for coming on the program and for spending the whole hour. I know I kept you a little bit over. What do you hope my listeners get out of this conversation, and how can they get the book?
Well, they can get the book at their local bookstores or online. And I hope they sort of appreciate that, we're facing a very big foreign policy challenge with Iran that could go off the rails. And many on the right and the left in the United States do not want another major war in the Middle East, do not want the United States to spend blood and treasure and get sucked back in the Middle East. And it's a time for us to seriously think about how do we get Iran to a different place. And in order to be able to think about that, we have to think about how do they see things right now, and not do it through our lens or name calling or simple caricature views, but really seriously grapple.
Not to interrupt you, it's not all about how we think about Iran. We have to think about how Iranians themselves, or how the Iranian state thinks about itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, we're playing chess. So we made moves. Let's not assume how they're going to play, right? So I think having a better knowledge of Iran, taking their fears, aspirations, strategic thinking, mistakes, successes seriously helps us devise better policy to manage this relationship towards a better place.
Thank you so much, Vali Nasr.
Thank you for inviting me. It's good to be with you.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.